At 71 years old, Loretta Boone thought her life was settled. She had spent the last 44 years living on a mountain homestead in the Blue Ridge Range of North Carolina, tending to her bees, growing her medicinal herbs, and standing beside her husband Hank through every season of their marriage. The land itself was not fancy, just 80 acres of rocky mountain terrain interspersed with ancient forest and steep hollows where waterfalls tumbled down slate cliffs. But it was home. Every tree held a memory, every stone path had been walked 1,000 times. The very air seemed to know her. Then Hank died, and everything changed in ways she could never have imagined. The world became unfamiliar overnight, though nothing in it had physically moved. It was as if the map of her life had been redrawn by someone else's hand, using rules and measurements that she had never agreed to. The funeral was held on a Saturday in March, with mountain rain falling steady and soft against the church windows. Hank had been a quiet man, a beekeeper and ginseng hunter who moved through the world with the kind of gentle steadiness that made people trust him immediately. He kept his own counsel, read old books about Appalachian history, and could identify every medicinal plant that grew within 3 miles of the homestead. His hands were permanently stained with honey and the tannins from ginseng root. His clothes always smelled faintly of wood smoke and the herbal tea that Loretta kept brewing on the cast-iron stove. The cancer came quickly. Within 6 months of the diagnosis, he was gone. Loretta had not had time to prepare herself, though she was not sure one ever really could prepare for that kind of absence. The doctor had said it was his lungs. Years of breathing in wood smoke in the smokehouse had done damage, they suggested. But Loretta wondered if it was not something deeper, some invisible wound that living in the modern world inflicted on people who belonged to the old world, whose bodies and spirits had been forged in a time before. Time moved so quickly and demanded so much. She had sat beside his hospital bed in those final weeks, watching him breathe, watching the way his body seemed to become less and less his own. The man she had married was still there. She could see him in the way his eyes would soften when they met hers, but his body was already leaving, already beginning the slow process of return to the earth. She had held his hand and talked to him about the homestead, about the bees, about the ginseng patch that he loved so much, trying to anchor him in the things he cared about most. But she could feel him slipping away, moving towards something she could not see or follow. In the end, she had simply sat with him as he died, her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat slow and then stop. It was the most intimate moment of their entire marriage, and also the loneliest. The grief was enormous and silent and private. Loretta moved through the homestead like a ghost those first few weeks, tending to the hives out of sheer muscle memory, letting the bees ground her in their rhythm and their purpose. The bees did not care that Hank was gone. They still needed the hives managed, the honey harvested, the frames inspected for disease. In some ways, working with the bees was the only thing that made sense. They were real. They were present. They followed their own ancient patterns and asked nothing of her except competent stewardship. At dawn, standing in the bee yard with the smoke billowing from the bellows, the very smoke that Hank had created so many times, she felt closest to him. The smoke connected her across the boundary between the living and the dead. Their marriage had never been one of grand gestures or romantic declarations. Hank was not the type of man who bought flowers or left love notes on pillows, but he was the kind of man who would wake up at 3 in the morning to help a sick horse in the barn, and who would spend hours teaching her the names of every plant that grew on their mountain. He was the kind of man who would hum while he worked, old Appalachian hymns and folk songs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. Their love had been built, slowly and steadily, through thousands of small moments of trust and presence. A hand reaching out across the dinner table. The way he would listen to her read passages from library books while he sat cleaning bee frames. The particular attention he would pay to her mood when she came home from town, always seeming to know, without being told, whether she needed to talk or whether she needed silence. Now he was gone, and the silence was so complete that she could hear the blood moving through her own veins. The house was too large. The bed was too wide. The kitchen, where she had spent so many mornings making coffee and planning the day's work, felt like a museum dedicated to a life she was no longer living. She would sometimes catch herself making enough breakfast for 2 people, and then she would stand there with the extra eggs in her hand and feel the weight of that small mistake as if it were a boulder. Everything was a mistake now. Everything was a reminder of what she had lost. Then, one morning in early April, while Loretta was still moving through her days in a kind of numbness that felt safer than actual grief, a truck rumbled up the dirt road to the homestead. It was Dale Boone, Hank's younger brother. Dale was a barrel-chested man with thick gray sideburns and a weathered red face that suggested he spent a good deal of time out of doors, though Loretta suspected it was more often in bars than in any legitimate work. He had never been close to Hank. There had always been something hard about Dale, something that resisted softness or nuance. He stepped out of the truck wearing a canvas Carhartt jacket and a smile that did not reach his eyes, the kind of smile that a predator might wear when it has spotted prey that it knows is injured and therefore vulnerable. With him was a lawyer, a thin, sharp-faced man in a gray suit and polished shoes that looked painfully out of place on a mountain road. The shoes were the first thing that made Loretta afraid. Proper shoes, city shoes, shoes that had not walked mountain dirt. The man wearing them meant business, and his business, she somehow knew immediately, was to take her home away from her. Dale gestured broadly with his thick hands in the way that suggested he was about to deliver news he had already convinced himself was reasonable and fair. But there was nothing reasonable about what he said next, and there was nothing fair about the way he said it, casually, as if he were remarking on the weather or a minor inconvenience, not describing the theft of her entire life's work and investment. Loretta felt something shift inside her, some fundamental support beam of her understanding of the world seeming to crack under an impossible weight. This man was her husband's brother. This man was family, bound to her by decades of shared meals and holiday celebrations. And he had come, not to mourn, not to offer comfort, but to claim what was not his. "Loretta," Dale said, and his voice was pitched in the same register as always, loud enough to fill a room, and then some. "We need to talk about the property. Daddy promised this land to my family before he passed. The house, the land, all of it. It was a verbal agreement, but it's binding, and we've got witnesses. He said it the way someone might say the sky was blue, as a simple statement of fact that required no further discussion or negotiation." Loretta felt something shift inside her, as if the ground beneath her feet was becoming unreliable. This was the first time in her 71 years that she truly understood that the world did not care about her understanding of fairness or right and wrong. "My lawyer here says we've got a clear case. Hank was just living here, but he didn't own it. Never did. Daddy always meant for the place to be held in trust for the whole family, and when Hank died without a will, it reverts to the family. That would be me as Daddy's only remaining son." Loretta tried to speak, but her voice seemed to have left her. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out but the faint sound of her own breath. The lawyer, whose name was Sherman or Thurston or something equally forgettable, began to arrange papers on the dining room table as if this were already settled, as if her objections were merely a formality to be gotten through before the real business of seizure could proceed. He spoke with the practiced condescension of a man who had spent years explaining simple concepts to people he considered beneath his intellectual station. He spoke of burden of proof. He spoke of oral agreements being binding in North Carolina. He spoke of the spirit of the law, which apparently was something that existed entirely in his interpretation of it. The lawyer nodded with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of representing people whose morality is somewhat flexible. He had the bearing of a man who had learned early in life that the law was not about justice, but about leverage, and that people with enough confidence and enough paperwork could convince others to believe almost anything. He began to explain about verbal promises, about Appalachian tradition, about the way property was sometimes held in common understanding rather than in writing. He spoke with the tone of someone educating a child, using words that he did not truly believe had meaning, but which he knew would impress a judge who had been trained in the same system of obfuscation. He spoke of witnesses, two men that Loretta had never heard of, both apparently friends of Dale's who were willing to swear that they had heard Eldon Boone, Hank's father, make this promise 30 years ago, before he died. Loretta wanted to point out that Eldon had died 15 years ago, not 30, and that she could not imagine him promising his home away when he had worked all his life to own it. But the lawyer had already moved on, constructing his argument like a wall, brick by brick, each lie mortaring the next into place until they created something that looked, from a distance, like a coherent structure. He explained that without a written will from Hank, and with this verbal claim backed by witnesses, the burden of proof fell on Loretta to prove that Hank had intended the property to pass to her. This was the cruelest part of the law. She would come to understand that the burden was not on the person making the outlandish claim, but on the person defending against it. "Do you have anything in writing?" the lawyer asked, looking at her over the rim of his glasses in a way that suggested he already knew the answer. The glasses themselves were a prop, Loretta realized. They were meant to convey authority and intelligence, to make her feel small and uninformed. She had spent 40 years in a library surrounded by books and learning, and now she was being made to feel ignorant by a man who specialized in moving words around until they changed shape. Loretta did not have anything in writing. Hank was the kind of man who kept important documents in a manila envelope in a drawer, but he was not the kind of man who spent time with lawyers or paperwork. He was a man of the mountains, and the mountains operated on different principles than the law did. He trusted that the life they had built together, the decades of work they had done on this land, the legal title that must have existed somewhere in the county records. He trusted that these things would be sufficient. He had believed in the basic goodness of people, in the idea that a man's word was his bond, and that the law existed to protect honest people, not to enable theft. But trust, Loretta was learning with brutal speed, was not the same as legal protection. Trust could be exploited. Trust could be weaponized. The lawyer explained with practiced patience that the court would likely side with Dale and his witnesses. He said the word witnesses, the way a magician might say the word evidence, as if their mere existence was proof of something, as if the fact that Dale had found two men willing to lie under oath somehow made the lies true. "It's worth settling this quickly," the lawyer suggested. "Rather than spending money on litigation you'd likely lose anyway." He said this with the tone of someone offering helpful advice to a friend, when what he was actually doing was describing the process of extortion, using the language of law. Settle quickly. Give up your home without a fight. Accept the theft gracefully. Loretta felt something inside her begin to calcify, to harden into a resolve that she had not known she possessed. She had lived through the death of her husband. She had lived through 40 years of mountain winters, and broken bones and illnesses and all the 1,000 small griefs that accumulate over a lifetime. She was not going to be intimidated by a lawyer in polished shoes. The trial, when it came, was a formality. The judge had apparently decided his position before entering the courtroom. He listened to Dale's lawyer present his witnesses, two men who claimed to remember a conversation from 30 years ago with perfect clarity, despite their visibly advanced impairment and unreliable personal finances. He did not seem to question why they had suddenly remembered this crucial detail in the months immediately following Hank's death, or why they would be willing to commit perjury for a man they barely knew. He listened to Loretta's attempts to explain that Hank had owned the property, that she had lived there for 44 years, that she and Hank had made improvements and repairs and invested their lives in the place. Then he ruled in Dale's favor. The decision was swift and final, delivered in language that made it clear that the judge felt he was simply upholding the law, not participating in an injustice. The law, he seemed to believe, was neutral. The law did not care about Loretta's 44 years of marriage or her contributions to the property. The law only cared about witnesses and oral agreements and the burden of proof. The law, when wielded by people with money and lawyers, could be a weapon. Within 4 months, the lawsuit was resolved, and her life was unmade. The judge's order was merciless. Loretta was given 90 days to vacate the homestead, the house, the bee yard, the gardens where she had spent 44 years of her life, the place where she had learned to keep bees, where she and Hank had built their life together, where she had healed from grief and grown old in the sunshine. The judge's order allowed her to keep only one thing, a crumb thrown to a beggar, a half-acre of land on which sat a crumbling fieldstone smokehouse built in the 1940s by Hank's grandfather from hand-laid river stone and creek mortar. It was roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with a heavy oak plank door hanging crooked on wrought iron hinges. A squat stone chimney rose from the back wall, blackened by decades of hickory smoke. The inside was likely full of rats by now. The roof probably leaked. It was a ruin, and that ruin was what Loretta was given in exchange for a lifetime of work and 44 years of marriage. Dale came to the homestead on the day of the eviction, and he brought a moving company with him. He stood on the porch wearing his Carhartt jacket and his confident smile, watching as Loretta's furniture was loaded onto trucks. She had packed her clothes into her brown leather suitcase with brass clasps, the one her parents had given her as a wedding gift 71 years ago. The suitcase held everything that mattered, which was almost nothing. She was wearing her faded denim work shirt and her olive green canvas pants and her brown leather hiking boots, the clothes that were most essentially hers. As she walked past Dale toward her old truck, he reached out and touched her arm. His hand was hot and his smile was terrible. "You should be grateful I didn't take the Smokehouse too, Loretta," he said. "It's worthless anyway, but it would have been cruel to leave you with nothing." She looked at him and saw something she had never fully registered before. A man so empty inside that he had to fill himself with the suffering of others. It was a terrible kind of pity that she felt in that moment. Not pity enough to forgive him, but pity nonetheless. Cruelty, Loretta thought, was relative. She had been married to Hank for 44 years. They had built a life together, raised no children, but cultivated a marriage that was deeper and richer than most families she knew. They had weathered hard times and celebrated quiet joys. They had learned each other's bodies and minds so completely that sometimes she would think something and Hank would say it aloud before she had even opened her mouth. They had stood together through miscarriage and illness and the quiet disappointments that life inflicted. They had laughed together at jokes that no one else understood. They had learned to be silent together without the silence becoming painful. And now, in the cruelest twist of all, she was being cast out into the world at 71 years old, with nothing but a half acre and a crumbling smokehouse that smelled of ancient hickory and soot. The injustice of it was almost incomprehensible. The finality was worse. There was no recourse, no higher court to appeal to, no way to undo what had been done. What had been stolen stayed stolen. That was the first rule of theft, she learned. Take it quickly and take it completely, and by the time anyone realizes what is missing, it is too late to recover. She found a small cabin about 3 miles down the mountain near the town of Asheville that she could rent month to month for a sum that was manageable on her small pension from the years she had worked as a school librarian before retirement. The cabin was simple and clean, almost aggressively clean in the way that rental properties often are, as if the cleanliness was meant to apologize for the smallness. 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people, a living room with a view of the ridge where her former homestead sat. The cabin was not hers. Everything in it belonged to someone else, was merely borrowed. She would be gone when the next tenant came along. There was no permanence here, no sense of belonging, but it was what she could afford, so it was what she had. On clear mornings, she could see the chimney smoke rising from what had been her home for nearly half a century. It was a small torture, that view. She would stand on the porch with her coffee in the early morning, always black, no sugar, the way Hank had liked it, and watch that smoke curl up into the morning air. She could imagine Dale moving through the rooms, sitting at her table, sleeping in her bed. The thought of it made her feel physically ill. She would watch that smoke and remember the sound of Hank's voice, the particular way he had of humming old hymns while he worked, Wayfaring Stranger and In the Garden and Jesus Loves Me, the smell of honey and beeswax that had permanently embedded itself in his clothes and in her memory of him. She wondered if Dale could smell it too, or if he was too ignorant of the world to recognize the traces of another man's life that filled the house. The mountain community was kind, in the way that mountain communities can be. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered condolences and sympathized with her about Dale and the injustice of the situation. Mrs. Henderson from down the way brought her a ham and sat at her kitchen table and wept for her. John Watkins, who had been a friend of Hank's for 40 years, came to her door and stood there without speaking for a long time before finally saying, "It ain't right, Loretta. None of it is right." But sympathy did not change the law. Sympathy did not return her home to her. Sympathy was a substitute for action, and action was something that the law did not permit Loretta to take. The few people she knew who had money or influence politely suggested that fighting Dale would be a waste of time and resources. The judge had ruled, and judges were not often reversed. "It's better to move forward," they told her kindly, using the language of acceptance when what they meant was resignation. "Build a new life. You're still young enough to start over." Loretta was 71 years old. She didn't feel young. She did not feel capable of starting over. What she felt was hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside her chest and removed all the things that had made her feel like a real person. She was a shell. She was a person-shaped absence. She was alive, but she wasn't really living. It was during one of these dark months, about 3 weeks after she had moved into the cabin, on a morning when the rain was falling soft and gray and seemingly endless, that Loretta found herself sorting through a coffee can of Hank's personal items, the things that had been in his pockets and his desk drawers, the small talismans that defined a life lived quietly but with intention. She had not been able to look at these things when she first packed them. They hurt too much. But now, in the isolation of the small cabin, she felt ready to remember them. His pocket knife, worn smooth from decades of use, the blade folded so often that it had created a groove in the handle shaped exactly like Hank's thumb, a brass lighter shaped like a tiny lantern that he had carried since his teenage years, his reading glasses with one lens slightly scratched from being dropped once in the bee yard, a bee smoker nozzle that had become his fidget toy of sorts, something he would hold and manipulate while he was thinking through a problem or making a difficult decision. Loretta had watched him do this thousands of times, twist and turn the nozzle while his eyes looked off into the distance, finding the answer to whatever question he was asking himself. And tucked deep inside the smoker nozzle itself, wedged so carefully that Loretta almost missed it, a folded scrap of paper in Hank's cramped, careful handwriting. The paper was thin and delicate, as if it had been touched many times by hands that knew its value and tried to be gentle with it. Loretta's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. Her eyes, magnified behind her small, round tortoiseshell glasses, scanned the words again and again, as if repetition might change their meaning or reveal a truth she was missing. Loretta, it read in Hank's unmistakable penmanship. The Smokehouse chimney, inside wall, third course up from the shelf. I mortared it in where the smoke would keep it safe. Everything that matters is there. H. She read it 5 times. She read it 10 times. 15 times. The words did not change. The meaning did not shift. Hank had planned this. Hank had anticipated this. Hank, who had always seemed to operate in the present moment, had been looking toward the future with enough clarity to make preparations. He had known that Dale was a problem. He had known that the law might fail her. He had known that she would need proof, that she would need documentation, that she would need something tangible to hold on to when the world tried to convince her that she had nothing. She sat on the edge of her small rented bed in the cabin she had never chosen and let the weight of those words settle onto her shoulders like a mantle, like a responsibility, like a gift so precious that she was not sure she was worthy of receiving it. Hank had left her something. He had left her a future. He had left her a way home. She did not pack much, but what she did pack was careful and intentional. A change of clothes, warm layers, because the mountain was cold even in May. A thermos of hot coffee, because she would need something warm to hold while she worked. A flashlight, because the smokehouse interior would be dark. Tools, a chisel, a hammer, and a crowbar from an old toolbox that the cabin's owner had left in the barn and seemed not to mind her borrowing. These were the tools of archaeology, of excavation, of recovery. She placed everything carefully in the brown leather suitcase with brass clasps that she had carried away from the homestead the day of the eviction. That suitcase had been her wedding gift from her parents 71 years ago. It had been new then, the leather soft and pale, the brass bright. Over the decades, it had darkened and weathered and accumulated scars. Her hands had held it for more than 7 decades. Hank had carried it on their single honeymoon trip to Gatlinburg when they were young and the world seemed full of infinite possibility. They had filled it with the simple clothes of young people in love, with nothing but each other and this suitcase and the whole world ahead of them. Now, all these years later, she would use that same suitcase to carry the tools that would recover what had been stolen from her, to carry them back to the place that had been taken, in search of whatever Hank had thought was important enough to mortify into a chimney wall, hiding it where the smoke would protect it. She left the cabin before dawn on a morning in May, when the mountains were still cool and the mist hung thick in the hollows, so thick that she could barely see the road in front of her. The world seemed to be only gray and white, all the solid things turned into suggestions, all certainty dissolved into fog. She drove her old truck as far as the logging road would take her, roads that she and Hank had driven many times, following the path of old timber operations and Forest Service access routes. Then she parked and gathered her suitcase and began to walk, following the trail that she and Hank had walked together for decades. The path climbed steeply, switchbacking up the mountainside through dense rhododendron thickets and tangles of mountain laurel, so thick that sometimes she had to push through them, and the wet leaves soaked her pants and her boots. The morning birds were singing in the canopy above her head, cardinals and wood thrushes and the territorial calls of warblers migrating north. The smell of damp earth and decomposing leaves rose up from the forest floor, the rich smell of decay and renewal that is the smell of the mountain's life cycle. Her boots, worn leather with good treads, found purchase on the rocky ground, on the moss-covered stones, on the roots that twisted across the path like the fingers of old hands reaching up from the earth. She was 71 years old, and she was climbing a mountain alone, carrying her wedding gift suitcase that held tools for recovery, walking toward a secret that her dead husband had left for her. She did not know if he had left her salvation or torture. She did not know if she would be able to find it, or if decades of weather had destroyed whatever he had hidden. She only knew that she had to try. That was enough. It took her 3 hours to reach the smokehouse. 3 hours of climbing and breathing hard and pushing through brambles that caught at her clothes and drew small lines of blood on her weathered forearms. Her calves burned. Her breath came short. At 71, she was not as strong as she had been, but she was still stronger than she looked. The mountain had kept her strong. She moved through the forest with the kind of sure-footed grace that comes from decades of knowing the terrain. The rocks did not slip beneath her feet. The roots did not trip her. The mountain knew her and held her steady. When she finally reached the smokehouse, her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. It was smaller than she remembered it, or perhaps she was just more aware of its fragility now. The way the ancient stones were settling unevenly, the way the mortar had begun to fail in certain places, creating small gaps where beetles and spiders had made homes. The way the roof was beginning to sag on one corner, weighed down by decades of rain and snow. Wild blackberry brambles grew up the north wall, and a mountain laurel bush had crowded so close to the door that she had to push through the branches to get inside. The door groaned on its wrought iron hinges, the sound it made mixing with the sound of the creek that ran nearby, creating a kind of duet between the human and the natural world. The interior was exactly as she had last seen it, soot-darkened stone walls that seemed to absorb light, rusted iron meat hooks hanging from a crossbeam where Hank had hung hams in the autumn when the curing season began, the collapsed wooden smoke shelf that they had used to cure those hams every autumn for 40 years, the floor of packed hard earth scattered with bits of old charcoal and the ash of countless fires. The place smelled of smoke and time and the particular musk of a space that had not seen much human presence recently. But it also smelled of home. It smelled of Hank. She set down her suitcase on the packed earth floor, and she let her eyes adjust to the dimness. A thin shaft of light came through a gap in the wall stones on the east side, illuminating a column of dust motes that floated in the still, smoky air. The light was beautiful in its way, the particles of dust catching it, and transforming the interior into something almost sacred, almost holy. She set down the suitcase and reached into her jacket pocket and found the candle that she had brought. She had known she would need light, had anticipated the darkness, had prepared for it the way Hank had taught her to prepare for things, carefully, thoughtfully, with respect for what you did not know. She lit the candle with her hands cupped around the small flame, creating a shelter for the fire, and the candlelight began to move through the smokehouse like a living thing, casting shadows and revealing secrets, making the space feel smaller and warmer at once. In the wavering candlelight, she looked for the chimney wall on the interior. There it was, rising from the back corner, built of the same hand-laid river stone as the exterior walls, but darkened by centuries of smoke, maybe more than centuries, maybe back to when the first Boone had built it. The stones were large and irregular, fitted together with an art that modern construction had lost. The mortar between them was old, so old that it had almost become stone itself, had been compressed and hardened by decades of use and weather and time. Third course up from the shelf. She counted the stones carefully, tracing with her fingertips along the mortar lines, using the candlelight to illuminate the spaces between the stones. The shelf had collapsed, making it difficult to determine exactly where the shelf had ended. But Hank had been thorough in his instructions. He had given her enough information to find it, had not left it entirely to chance. She was moving with the kind of patience that comes from years of working with bees, understanding that some tasks could not be rushed, that they had their own timeline and their own pace. She counted up from what would have been the center of the shelf, measuring with her hands, estimating the height in her mind. And then she saw it, a stone that was slightly lighter in color than the others, with newer mortar around it. Not new by the standards of a regular construction project, but new relative to the 200-year history of this chimney. The mortar was also slightly different in texture, as if it had been applied with more recent knowledge and materials, rather than the traditional creek mortar that held the rest of the structure together. This was Hank's work. She was certain of it. He had done this himself, probably over a period of weeks or months, working slowly so as not to be noticed, creating a void in the chimney wall and then sealing it with care and attention. He had left it for her to find. She began to work at the mortar with her chisel, tapping gently at first and then with increasing force as the old mortar began to crack and crumble. Her hands, calloused from decades of beekeeping and gardening, knew how to work stone and wood and the deep things of the earth. The chisel bit into the mortar, creating small clouds of dust that hung in the candlelight like tiny ghosts, like the spirits of all the years that had passed since Hank had mortared this stone in place. The sound the chisel made echoed through the small space of the smokehouse, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to match her heartbeat, seemed to harmonize with the sound of the creek outside, seemed to be the sound of something ancient and important being disturbed after a long sleep. Bit by bit, she worked the mortar free. The stone was heavy, old river stone worn smooth by centuries in a riverbed before being pulled from the water and set into a wall. But she had leverage, and desperation made her strong. It took her nearly an hour. Her shoulders burned. Her hands bled where the chisel had rubbed her palms raw. Her breath came short, and pain lanced through her lower back with each strike. But finally, the stone began to shift. She wedged the crowbar into the space and pried with what felt like all her remaining strength, and the stone came loose with a sound like a sigh, like a long breath of relief, and it tumbled forward into her waiting hands. It was heavier than she expected, and she nearly dropped it, but she managed to set it on the floor beside her, and there was the void. There was the hollow space. There was what Hank had left for her. Behind the stone was a cavity in the chimney wall, a deliberate void that Hank must have carved out himself over years of patient work, over the slow accumulation of hours spent carefully removing stone and mortar, creating a space that was invisible to anyone who did not know where to look, a secret place inside a secret place. And in that cavity, wrapped carefully in oilcloth that had somehow survived the decades of heat and smoke and moisture, preserved by the dry air and the careful sealing, was a cast-iron lockbox. It was small, not more than a foot long and 6 inches wide, but it was substantial, heavy, built to last, built to protect whatever lay inside. The lid and sides bore the oxidized patina of age, the rust-orange coloring of cast iron that has been exposed to decades of mountain weather, but the metal itself was strong, was solid, would endure. The oilcloth wrapping it was deteriorated but intact, had done its job. She lifted the lockbox carefully, as if it were made of glass, as if a wrong move might cause it to shatter and spill its contents into the dust. It was heavier than she expected, and the weight of it seemed to carry significance beyond its physical mass. It felt like the weight of decades of love. It felt like the weight of preparation and foresight. It felt like the weight of a man's entire being, concentrated into a single object. She set it on a flat stone and examined it in the candlelight, afraid almost to touch it, afraid that her touch might somehow diminish whatever it contained, afraid that the magic of it might break if she moved it the wrong way. The wax seal broke under her gentle pressure, crumbling into red flakes that fell onto the dirt floor and disappeared into the dust. The lockbox was not locked. It had no keyhole. Just a simple latch that opened with a soft click that echoed in the quiet space. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth and protected from the decades of mountain weather and the heat of countless curing fires, were 3 separate items, arranged with care and intention. The first was a folded document, yellowed with age but still legible, the paper holding its integrity despite the passage of time. She opened it carefully, her hands shaking as she read the words, her eyes scanning the letters and trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was a notarized deed, dated 1971, transferring the entire 80-acre homestead to one Hank Boone, signed and witnessed and sealed by the Buncombe County Notary Public, whose name and signature were visible in the corner of the document, official and binding and absolutely real. It was in Hank's name alone. No conditional language, no shared property claim, no loopholes or verbal contingencies, no suggestion that Dale had any claim whatsoever. The language was clear. To have and to hold to the said Hank Boone and to his heirs forever. It was a complete, unambiguous transfer of property, and it was completely contrary to everything Dale had claimed in court, which meant that everything Dale had done was based on a lie, which meant that the judge had been wrong, which meant that the law might actually be able to serve justice after all. The second item was a collection of hand-drawn maps, each one painstakingly detailed with topographic features and marked with small X's and notes in Hank's meticulous handwriting that she knew as well as her own. She recognized them immediately, with a shock that was almost physical. Ginseng patches, all of them. Every single wild ginseng location that Hank had ever found in the 30 years that he had been hunting the mountains around their homestead. Maps that she had never known he was creating, although now that she thought about it, all the time she had seen him studying topographic maps with a magnifying glass, the times he had disappeared into the deep forest for hours and come back with dried ginseng roots that he kept in jars, the careful notes he would make in small notebooks that she had seen him carrying. All of this made sense now. He had been creating an archive. He had been documenting knowledge that took a lifetime to accumulate. Each map included terrain notes, creeks, rock formations, elevations, the direction the roots faced, the time of year they were most valuable, and dates, some going back 3 decades, to when Hank was just a young man, learning the art of ginseng hunting from his own father. These were not casual notations dashed off on a whim. These were the results of a lifetime of patient work, of walking the ridges and the hollows at all hours of the day and night, of learning the secret places where the rarest and most valuable plant in Appalachia grew wild, understanding its needs and its rhythms, protecting it and cultivating it while making it seem like wild growth. Wild ginseng root, the real thing, not the cultivated variety, sold for $800 to $1,200 per pound to the right buyers, to the pharmaceutical companies and the traditional medicine practitioners and the researchers who understood its value. Hank's maps documented at least 14 major patches, possibly more, some of which appeared to be large enough and well established enough to sustain ethical harvesting for generations to come. The knowledge in these maps was worth a fortune. The knowledge was also priceless because it could never be replaced, and if the patches were disrupted or harvested unsustainably, it would take another lifetime to restore them. The third item was a letter, also in Hank's careful handwriting, addressed to her, and dated about 3 months before his death, when he had already begun to feel the cancer eating away at him, already begun the slow process of letting go of the physical world while trying to make arrangements for the ones he loved. Loretta, it began, and those simple 2 words held so much love and intention and the whole weight of their life together that she had to stop and breathe through the sudden overwhelming grief that threatened to pull her under like a current, to sweep her away into some dark place where she might not be able to return. Her hands shook so badly that the letter rustled in her grip like something alive. She forced herself to continue reading. By the time you read this, I will be gone, and Dale will have come to take the homestead. I've known for years that he would try this. He's always been bitter about the fact that Daddy left the land to me instead of dividing it evenly between us. I never mentioned it to you because I didn't want you to worry, and I hoped that maybe the law and the courts would actually work the way they're supposed to work, that justice and truth would prevail, even without me there to fight for it. But I'm not going to take that chance. I can't leave you vulnerable to that man. The deed is there with the ginseng maps. I hid the deed here because Dale would have burned it if he'd ever found it. He's that kind of man, willing to destroy the truth rather than accept a reality that doesn't serve him. He would have marched into the courthouse and burned that deed if he thought it would give him an advantage. He's willing to lie, willing to find false witnesses, willing to do whatever it takes. So I hid it here, where the smoke would keep it safe, where only you would ever think to look. The smoke hides everything, Loretta. That's what they used to say about smokehouses. Hid the meat from the elements, hid the smell from spreading across the mountains, hid the truth of all the work that goes into keeping a body fed through the winter, the labor and the skill and the patience required to cure meat properly. The smoke was like a kind of mercy. It obscured the difficult things, made the process invisible. But the truth doesn't burn. That's what I've learned in the years that I've had with you. The truth doesn't burn, and it doesn't decay, and it doesn't fade. It survives. And I wanted this truth to survive, and I wanted it to come to you, because I trust you more than I trust anyone in the world. I trust your judgment, your strength, your goodness. You've spent your whole life in a library surrounded by books and knowledge, and you understand the value of preserving things that matter. You understand how to keep something alive. You're going to have to decide what to do with the ginseng maps. They're worth a great deal of money, more than we could spend in the rest of our lives, probably. Botanical companies and universities and pharmaceutical manufacturers would pay a fortune for information like that. Someone could get rich off those maps. But they're also irreplaceable. The patches have taken 30 years to find and cultivate, and they could take 1,000 years to regenerate naturally if they were disrupted or harvested unsustainably. The knowledge in those maps represents a lifetime of work, a lifetime of love for this land, and for the plants that grow here. Think carefully about what you do with them. Don't let the money blind you. Let your heart guide you. But know this, the land is yours. The homestead is yours. The bees are yours. The ginseng patches are yours. It's always been yours, even when the court said it wasn't, even when Dale took it from you. The law might fail you, but the truth will not. Love, Hank. Loretta read the letter by candlelight, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, leaving trails through the dust and soot that had accumulated on her skin during the hours of work. She read it once, and then she read it again, and then a third time, trying to slow down the moment, trying to extend it, trying to exist in the space where Hank's voice was still present, where his words were still creating the shape of the world around her. She sat in the darkness of the smokehouse with her dead husband's words in her hands, and she wept. She wept for the injustice of his death, which had left her vulnerable to Dale's claim, had stripped her of her protector. She wept for his foresight in hiding the deed, which proved that he had known exactly what kind of man his brother was, had understood the darkness in Dale's heart with a clarity that she, with her naive faith in family bonds and human goodness, had not been able to see. She wept for all the years they had spent together on this land, building something real and true and beautiful, something that had been stolen from her, but was now, miraculously, impossibly, hers again. And she wept because she understood, finally and completely, that Hank's love for her had been so deep and so complete that he had spent the last months of his life, months that he knew were numbered, that he knew were ending, not focused on his own pain or his own fear of death, but focused entirely on her protection, on ensuring that she would be safe and that she would know the truth even after he was gone. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the smokehouse with the door closed and the candle burning, reading the deed over and over, studying the ginseng maps and trying to memorize their locations and the details of each patch. The candle burned down, and she lit another one. Her hands traced the lines that Hank had drawn, understanding finally that these were not just maps. They were love letters. They were declarations of devotion. They were Hank's way of saying that he had spent his life truly seeing the world around him, truly understanding it, truly loving it. By dawn, when the light began to filter through the stones and the birds began to sing in the forest canopy above, she had made her decision. She would take the deed to a lawyer, not the lawyer that had failed her before, but a new one who specialized in property disputes and land rights, one who had not already decided to side with the powerful. She would present the deed to the court and demand justice. She would not hide anymore. She would not accept the theft silently. The law had failed her once, but that was not the law's final word on the matter. As for the ginseng maps, she would protect them. She would not sell them, though she suspected that botanical companies and universities would offer her a great deal of money for them, more money than she could possibly need. Instead, she would place them in a conservation trust, protecting the patches from commercial harvesting forever, honoring Hank's lifetime of work and his implicit understanding that some things were too precious to monetize, that some gifts from the earth should be protected rather than exploited. The lawyer's response to the original deed was immediate and powerful. "This changes everything," he said, examining the document with genuine excitement. "This deed supersedes any verbal claim. It proves that Hank owned the property outright, with no contingencies or shared claims. Your brother-in-law's case collapses completely." When the deed was presented to the court, Dale's lawyer attempted to argue that it was a forgery or that there was some technical flaw in the notarization, but the Buncombe County Notary Public's seal was genuine, the signature was authentic, and the chain of title was clear. Dale's witnesses suddenly became much less confident in their testimony when confronted with actual legal documentation. Within 3 weeks, the case was reversed. Within a month, the court had ordered Dale off the property and required him to pay damages to Loretta for wrongful eviction and emotional distress. It was a vindication so complete and so powerful that Loretta almost could not believe it was real. She had walked into a courthouse expecting to lose again, and instead, she had walked out with her justice, her land, her home. She had walked out with her life restored. The community buzzed with the news. The elderly woman who had been treated so unfairly had actually won. The story spread through the mountains like smoke, and people who had felt helpless in their own circumstances against powerful men with lawyers suddenly felt like there might be hope, that maybe justice was not entirely the province of the wealthy and connected. Dale, humiliated, packed a truck with his belongings and left North Carolina for Tennessee, leaving word through a mutual acquaintance that he had better things to do than sit around dealing with family drama. He did not have the capacity to feel genuine shame about what he had tried to do, but he understood that he had lost the social game, and that was enough to make him leave. Loretta did not hear from him again. She did not need to. She had what she needed: her home, her truth, and her future. The restoration of the homestead took months. Loretta worked with contractors who understood the value of what they were restoring, who treated the old house and the bee yard and the ginseng patches with the reverence they deserved. She brought in experts to certify the conservation easement, to document the ginseng patches officially, to ensure that the knowledge Hank had accumulated would be preserved even after she was gone. She stood in her bee yard in the spring, with the sun warm on her face and the sound of thousands of bees moving around her, and she felt something in her heart settle into place. This was hers. This was home. This was justice. This was love made tangible, made real, made permanent. She moved back into the homestead in early June, and the return felt like resurrection. The house smelled of Dale's presence, cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke, and her first act was to open every window and let the mountain air blow through the rooms, cleansing the space of his occupation, returning it to what it had been. Every window in the house was open to the morning and the evening, and the soft mountain breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and honeysuckle. She walked through the rooms and let her hands touch the walls and the doors and the old furniture that had absorbed so many years of her life with Hank. The walls seemed to exhale, seemed to release the tension that had been stored in them. The house recognized her touch. It welcomed her home. The bee yard was overgrown, but the hives, neglected though they had been, had survived. The bees had clustered together and maintained their own survival without human intervention, had done what bees do, persevere, adapt, continue. When Loretta began to tend them again in the early morning, moving slowly and with familiar movements that her body remembered perfectly, they seemed to recognize her, to respond to her presence with a kind of relief, as if they too had been waiting for the restoration of their proper order. The sound they made was different, calmer, more focused, more purposeful. They had missed her as much as she had missed them. The bees had always known who their keeper was, and they had waited faithfully for her return. The ginseng patches were healthy and thriving. She walked each one in the weeks after her return, using Hank's maps and the details of his notes to refamiliarize herself with the locations. Some of the patches had been in the family for so long that the ginseng had become semi-domesticated, growing in patterns that suggested Hank's careful tending over decades. Others were still wild, hidden in deep hollers and rocky places that required careful hiking to access. She photographed each patch, took detailed notes, and eventually worked with a botanist from the University of North Carolina to have the collection officially cataloged and authenticated. The botanist was astonished. "This is the most comprehensive wild ginseng survey in Appalachian history," she told Loretta. "The detail is extraordinary. The value of this information, in terms of conservation and scientific understanding, is incalculable." But Loretta did not sell the information. Instead, she worked with the Conservancy to place the entire homestead under a conservation easement that would protect the ginseng patches from commercial harvesting in perpetuity. The easement would restrict her own ability to develop the land or cut the forests, but it would also ensure that the work Hank had done over 30 years would not be undone for profit. The Conservancy valued the easement in the millions of dollars, which meant that Loretta received a substantial tax benefit that effectively made her financially secure for the rest of her life. She had not sought this outcome, but it was a gift that Hank had left for her, and she accepted it with gratitude. The smokehouse became the symbol of her return. She had it carefully restored by a mason who specialized in historical stonework, ensuring that the restoration honored the original construction while strengthening the structure for continued use. Once the work was complete, she began the old autumn tradition again, curing ham in the smokehouse every fall, using hickory smoke just as Hank had taught her, just as his grandfather had taught him. The smoke rose from the chimney in the crisp autumn air, visible for miles across the mountains, a signal to anyone who knew how to read it that the proper order had been restored, that justice had prevailed, that love had outlasted betrayal. She began to teach again, in a way, not in a school library, but in the community. She taught local school children about Appalachian ecology, about beekeeping, about the ancient traditions of foraging and plant cultivation. She opened the homestead for visits by university researchers and conservation groups who wanted to study her ginseng patches or learn from her knowledge of mountain gardening. She became, in her late 70s, a local institution, the keeper of old knowledge, the woman who had fought for justice and won, the steward of land that held more meaning than its mere acreage could suggest. Years passed. Loretta grew older, and her hair, which had turned white in her 60s, grew longer and whiter still. She wore it in a single loose braid draped over her shoulder, and she still put on her faded denim work shirt every morning and her worn olive-green canvas pants, and she still carried her hands in a way that suggested they knew how to do real work. The suitcase with the brass clasps sat in her closet, a relic of that journey she had taken to reclaim her life, but she brought it out sometimes and held it and remembered the fear and the courage that it had required to walk up that mountain alone. The leather was still good. The brass was still bright. The suitcase was not broken. It still held the shape of her hands. The smokehouse that had once been a symbol of loss became a symbol of restoration. She had it carefully rebuilt, bringing in a mason who understood the old ways of working stone, who knew how to mix mortar that would last another 100 years, who treated the ancient structure with the reverence it deserved. The final step was replacing the stone she had removed that day, the one she had chiseled out while searching for Hank's secret. She held that stone in her hands before it was mortared back into place, and she pressed it against her chest and whispered a thank you to Hank, to the mountain, to time itself, to whatever providence had allowed her to find what he had hidden for her. Then she stepped back and watched the mason seal it back into the wall, and the smokehouse was whole again, healed, made complete. The truth was still inside, hidden again, safe again, protected by the smoke that would rise from the chimney for generations yet unborn. Dale's letter came in the mail one day, years after the eviction had been reversed and he had left North Carolina. It was brief and awkwardly formal. I've been thinking about what happened, and I want to apologize. I was wrong. I've had time to think about who I was and who I want to be, and I realize that I treated you unfairly. If there's any way that I can make amends, I'd appreciate the opportunity. Loretta read it twice. She did not feel anger anymore. That had burned away in the smokehouse, in the months of grief and injustice that had followed Hank's death. But she did not feel compelled to respond either. She had moved beyond the need for Dale's apology or his understanding. She had her land. She had her truth. She had Hank's love, which had proven to be more powerful than greed, more durable than lies, more real than any legal judgment could ever be. She placed the letter in a drawer and never thought about it again. Instead, she walked her land. The ginseng patches, the bee yard, the restoration of the smokehouse. And she understood that she had been given a rare and precious gift. She had been betrayed, and the betrayal had been reversed. She had lost everything, and everything had been returned to her. She had been alone, and she had been given the chance to be alone on her own terms, in her own home, with her own purpose clear. At 71, she had thought her life was finished. At 85, she understood that it was only just beginning again, beginning fresh, beginning with the hard-won knowledge that love, if it is real and deep and true, survives everything. The story of Loretta Boone is the story of the last chapter, the place where life's final acts reveal their true meaning, where betrayal can be overcome by the careful preparation of love, where justice, though slow, is ultimately possible if you have the courage to seek it. The mountains around her were eternal. The ginseng patches that Hank had found and cultivated were now protected for generations yet unborn, the knowledge preserved and the plants protected from exploitation. The bees in her yard continued their ancient work of pollination and honey-making, connecting every flower and fruit tree on the property in an intricate web of mutual dependence and care. The homestead, restored and healed, became a beacon for others, a place where people came to learn about Appalachian ecology, where schoolchildren were taught the value of the old ways, where researchers studied the ginseng patches as a living archive of botanical knowledge. And Loretta, standing on the porch of her home at golden hour, watching the sun sink behind the Blue Ridge Range and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, understood that this was what Hank had wanted for her. Not wealth or fame or vindication, though those had come, but simply this: the ability to come home, to tend what she loved, to honor what was true, and to know that, in the end, the smoke does hide everything, but the truth, the real truth, the truth that lives in the heart and the hands and the daily work of keeping something alive and real in this world, the truth does not burn. The truth endures. And so had she. This is the testimony of love. This is the power of preparation and foresight. This is what it means to protect the ones you love, even from beyond the grave, even when the world tries to steal what is yours. Hank Boone left his wife a smokehouse, and in that smokehouse, he left her the keys to her own justice. The last chapter is not an ending. It is a reclamation, a restoration, a return to what was always meant to be. And Loretta, who at 71 thought she was finished, discovered that at 85 she was only just beginning. The story of Loretta Boone endures in the mountains of North Carolina, whispered on the evening wind, told by people who have come to understand what it means to fight for justice and to trust in the power of love that transcends death. Visitors come to the homestead to learn about ginseng cultivation and beekeeping, and while they are there, they hear the story of a man's devotion, the story of a woman's courage, the story of a smokehouse that held a secret that changed everything. The smoke still rises from the chimney each autumn when the hams are cured, a signal that carries across the mountains saying, "The truth endures, love endures, justice is possible, you are not forgotten,